Hey all. So I really like to start the semester with talking about this article called Where Are the Experts? I use the word article a little bit liberally because it's actually the journal it comes from, Hispania, the guy writing, who is one of the authors of our book, I'll say. So you'll see this is consistent with a lot of things that we'll be talking about this semester. But the author is one of the major editors of this journal. So it's more like a letter from the editor. Let's be honest. It's a letter from the editor in a journal. So where are the experts? By implicature, Van Patten is going to suggest that they are not where you think. Experts of what? Of second language acquisition. So the first question is, you know, Van Patten's asking himself, how do we get educators of second languages, so, German and ASL and Russian and Japanese and Spanish and whatever, how do we get them using the most updated knowledge that we have about second language acquisition? Now, here, he's going to talk in terms a lot of like European languages because he does research on Spanish. You'll see an example later about Spanish, but this is applicable to a much broader array of languages. So when you see us using European languages in this particular article, it's more a reflection of the author. Okay. So Van Patten would note most collegiate departments, so college, university departments, where one can find Spanish, French, German, and other non-English disciplines are referred to as language departments. And so the question that he's asking is, are they composed of experts in language, aka linguists? Is it composed of experts of literature and culture? Um, or something else? So what Van Patten claims, and he's going to show us a little data about this, is that representative demographic research, so population stuff, shows experts in language, linguists, is quite a low percentage. And he's going to talk a little bit about the consequences, right? And to this end, his question is, who is driving the bus of language development? And he's a colorful guy, so he's being colorful on purpose. He does stand-up comedy at conferences sometimes. He's a very strange fella. Anyway, what is the study of language? And as linguistics students, I hope that this is important to you as well. So most language departments, so if you talk about the average Spanish department, I'll pick on Spanish because I do some of that stuff. But so the average Spanish department, the focus is on not on how language works or what language is, it's on cultural stuff and literary studies. Now, I'm not saying those are bad things, but if I want someone to teach me a language, maybe that's not the only thing I need to know. Literary and cultural studies, according to this article, would involve the analysis and preservation of cultural productions, such as literary texts and essays and theater and film, etc., right? Whereas that's kind of research, the research of literary studies and such, the expertise of analysis is text, right? Nowhere in contemporary cultural literary studies is language itself, right? And I'm not talking about how colorful is this metaphor. Language, the science of language, the object of research. These are things that we miss out on. We miss out on talking about what is the nature of language, what is its representation in the mind or brain of humans, how is it processed, how is it acquired, how is it used. And if you look at this, if you think of cultural and literary scholars as experts of text, in turn that makes them not experts in language. Okay, this is a strong, strong statement that most cultural and literary scholars would object to. But if you are thinking of language as a science, as a biological function of the human, as we do, they aren't experts in language. So here's a sample, right? So here's a sentence from the article, and Van Patten's first name is Bill, so this is what he provided. Where does Bill teach? And he gave the translational rough equivalent in Spanish, ¿Dónde enseña Bill? Right? Two differs from one in that, well, they both start with the word where, ¿Dónde is where? Bill, who is the subject, is at the end now. It's post-verbal. And English has the word does, which is non-existent in Spanish. So we get something like, two would be roughly, where teaches Bill, right? So a non-expert in language, their lesson on how to learn to do this. Imagine that you speak Spanish, you're trying to learn English, that instructor could say, okay, insert a do. And that's the extent of their class. which it doesn't really cover it. And if I'm, a speaker of English teaching Spanish, as I do sometimes, I could say, hey, guess what? That subject and that verb flip over, right? They invert. Suddenly it's subject second, which also doesn't really capture what's going on, right? So a language expert, aka a linguist, us, right? You're in the major, right? Or the minor, but probably the major. Matters to you. It should matter to you. We would know that this is just a surface description of what is happening, right? In the syntax and or morphology. It, one, doesn't tell you about the mental processes, and two, isn't really reflecting stuff under the surface. Now, Van Patten, again, he's asking who's driving the bus. Is it linguists? And to ruin the surprise, and no one should be ruined judging by the existence of this article at all, the answer is no. He gathered data from 3 regions, particularly from major research institutions that offer doctoral programs in Spanish and French. I can tell you why this is. It's mostly because the kind of institutions that offer doctorate programs, so grad school that produces PhDs in foreign languages, right? In languages besides English, almost exclusively do it in Spanish and French in the United States. It's just a population thing. It's probably not ideal, by which I mean it isn't. I've known a few like Italian PhDs and stuff, some German ones. I've made a couple Asian language ones. The point is that if you're looking at demographics, if you're looking at population, you're going to find concentrations in these 2 particular languages, which doesn't make them better. It just happens to be currently how it is. So the reason why he chose these, besides the choice of those languages, is that these kinds of institutions are a source of graduate training and education of faculty, right? So-called delineation or creation of expertise, right? So if I'm graduating a bunch of PhDs in French, those PhDs go out and say, I'm an expert in French, and they lead programs, right? They serve as models. The institutions themselves serve as models for other kinds of universities that go, well, this institution has PhDs and this is how they do it, right? And so the question ends up being, how is this information being, like, who is teaching this information to the people who subsequently teach it to other people? One of these regions I belong to, right? And so, in my particular institution, we were half linguists and half literature culture people. And so we did send out some linguists into the world to teach language science. But this isn't true of all institutions, as you will see. This particular sample of universities comes from the Midwest and then 2 coasts from August 2014, so recent-ish. And it does study the percentage of faculty with expertise in some kind of language science. Now notice, not all linguists are SLAers, second language acquisition people, like myself, right? But linguists know something about language, surely. Percentage specifically by the type, are they language acquisition people or not? And then, of course, everything else. So here we're looking at the Midwest, okay? They call the CIC in the universities. But here you see on the left categories of types of PhDs and faculty who teach in these programs. So this is the percentage of the faculty who is teaching the students. And you see a column for Spanish and a column for French. So for literary and cultural studies in the Midwest, 76% of the faculty teaching the outgoing PhDs are experts in literary and cultural studies. Kind of high. But for French, it is 90%. So not a lot of linguists teaching people to go out. Linguistics, you get 15% in Spanish and 8% in French. Specifically language acquisition, which is lumping in first language acquisition people like Dana and people like myself in second language, although I assume that Dana knows more about it than someone who's never taken an acquisition course, let's say. 8% and 2% gets less. And then other things like methodology and translation is, sort of marginal. So that's not a whole lot in the Midwest. Let's take a look at the West Coast. So now we're talking Berkeley and all those guys. All right, literary and cultural studies, Spanish, 90%. Whoops. Even more literary and cultural studies. 95 for French. And notice that the numbers overall are smaller here because there are less programs that award PhDs in languages like this on the West Coast. Linguistics, we get 10%, which is 6 people in Spanish, and 4%, which is 2 people in French. And then language acquisition, there is nobody in Spanish and 1 lonely, brave soul in French. And then if we do East Coast, well, it gets a little better, okay? not quite even as high as the Midwest, which isn't saying a lot. The literary cultural studies, 80% Spanish and 96% French. 15% are linguists, so that's great. A plus. That was the same as the Midwest. 4% in French that were linguistics. Language acquisition specifically, 7%. It's okay, right? And again, these are PhD awarding institutions. These are not, ours wouldn't be in here, for example. And so again, we're interested because these are the people sending out future professors to other places and are serving as examples to other places. Okay, that's why it matters. And so if you combine them all of the regions, you get this particular table. So 79% of the Spanish faculty across the entire country, basically, do literary and cultural studies in Spanish, and 92 in French, right? 14% do linguistics in Spanish and 6% in French. 6% do language acquisition in Spanish and 2% in French. 1% do something else in Spanish, and there's nobody in French doing translation or methodology. So this is pretty clear who is driving the bus of language acquisition, right? Who is teaching people how to teach languages? And it should give you pause. It certainly gives me pause. Okay, so takeaway points, just if you're looking at this later, combined expertise of tenure-line faculty, PhD granting institutions isn't particularly high in SLA or language acquisition more generally, it's still lower. Okay. So where are there no experts? What's not resembled in our last table is that of 20 institutions that were examined that had no language acquisition experts at all in Spanish, so half of them, right? 78% had no language acquisition experts in French. 0% of Ivy League's French-Spanish programs had no language scientists. Sorry, had any. So Ivy League, there is no linguist out there, right? MIT doesn't count because MIT's got a bunch, right? And this is according to Van Patten, of course. And the question is, what are the consequences? The two major ones that Van Patten would say, and there's a bunch in this original article, so if you're interested, ask me, but it's, lengthy. Two of them stick out to me, at least, that there is a perpetuation of myths about language, what it is and how it's acquired. And that there are, about language itself, and then what it is and how it's acquired is number two. Perpetuation of myths about language acquisition and language teaching, right? If we don't really know how people learn, if we don't really know how they process information, the role of different modalities, if we don't really understand it, myths can arrive and be perpetuated, okay? So for example, some myths about language. Language is a list of rules, like those things found in textbooks. It's not. It's really, truly not. If you haven't taken syntax yet, please take this into your brain, absorb it, and revisit it once you finish that semester. If you have, you should know what I mean. It's not a list of rules. It's a phenomenon, as it were. Verbal paradigms are psychologically real. When I say verbal paradigms, I'm thinking of the traditional, so the languages that have different endings, let's say, for different people, or if it's plural or singular, and this is a lot of the Western languages, but not all of them, some of the Eastern languages, et cetera, et cetera. There is people agreement, for example, in signed languages, so here's like me giving to you, it's first to second, third person to third person, second to first, second to third, I think, right? So this sort of stuff exists in lots of languages, of course. And so the question ends up being, when it's morphology, for example, some people believe that this is like, that I have a table of endings in my head and I just have to access the right one to speak right. No, that's not how that works. For example, verb endings are part of the grammar and then part of, as opposed to part of the lexicon, right? When you go and study morphology in our program as well, you'll learn a little bit more about that. And of course, there's myths about communication more generally, that language is only a social phenomenon or language is only frequency-based or lots of that stuff. And acquisition has a big problem with people believing it's frequency. It's not. Right? Frequency matters, but it's not all of language acquisition. Now, this particular slide features some of the things that Van Patten's research would suggest, right? Now, this is only one person's research. It's not to say it's everyone's beliefs. And I agree with him about 80%. I find him to be a little bit strong, hard-edged on some of these things, right? But that doesn't mean that there isn't some truth to what he's saying. So for example, Van Patten would say explicitly teaching grammar and vocabulary isn't necessary and it's not beneficial. So he says that's a myth, as you can see on this slide. And we actually will talk about instruction, right? We will get back to that. Van Patten's stance is that instruction is useless. And he has a reason for saying that. He's not just making it up. He's actually looked into it and he has some reason to say what he's saying, but it is a very hard line claim that is probably we should soften a little maybe, but debatable, okay? And we will get to this question in our book. I believe it's Q7. I think I have them mostly memorized now that I've taught this for like 4 years. But anyway, this particular one is a little controversial and interesting. At the very least, we should consider it, okay? And we'll see why. Another myth is the correction of learner output is necessary. So if you say something or assign something wrong in a class, for me to say, oh, you should say it like this. There's some research that suggests that me correcting you is irrelevant. That practice makes perfect. This is a claim about automation or output. There are some theories that say that's useful, and there's theories that say that it isn't, and Van Patten ascribes to the one that says it isn't. That learners acquire rules and paradigms. That I have memorized charts, and that is useful in this particular moment. It's not. You can't access that stuff fast enough. It's just, there's no way. Not speech, writing maybe. But learning vocabulary and grammar is a prerequisite to learning to communicate. No, not really. First language transfer is a source of all learning problems, and we will talk about transfer. But transfer is when I take stuff I'm using in one language and use it in another. So first language transfer for someone like me would be me using things from English in my Spanish. Things like if I forget to put the adjective after the noun, because, Spanish is one of those languages where you say la casa roja, which is like house red as opposed to red house. So if I start saying la roja casa, in many contexts, that someone could say, that's your English, right? But, it's going too far to say that it's all of our problems. There's lots of things beyond that can be problems. And this one, and we'll talk a little bit about this too. This is a claim about the critical period, which is, I think, question 2 or 3. I think it's 3. That adults learn languages different from children. Van Patten is hardline saying that no, we learn exactly the same, there's just other stuff going on, right? And we'll talk about this too, right? So these are claims about myths about acquisition teaching, and to some degree I agree with him. He's being really intense about it, but I see exactly why he would say that. And the thing is that these claims would be so counterintuitive to some of the people teaching languages, even though they're based on science, even if we quibble in the details, that's kind of a problem. You have to ask yourself, why do these things perpetuate, and why do we allow them to perpetuate? There's a little bit on here about why children and adults learn languages differently. The 40 years of research in adult second language acquisition cast serious doubt. There are some details that we'll talk about further along. I will put up this PowerPoint if you want to read them at this point, but it's not super important right now because we will talk about the critical period, right? That's what it has to do with. Okay, so our summary quickly, ready? Most of the institutions that train language instructors or serve as a model to those who do are primarily composed of non-language science faculty, non-linguists. Training, therefore, is often centered in study, literature, or culture, which, though being interesting and important and teaches a lot about people, is not the same as, people employing language science. The result is a perpetuation of myths and inconsistency in the success of language courses. People who use language science-based methods often have more success with their students. There are exceptions, of course, but sometimes the instructors that are not using language science in order to teach their courses are doing so heuristically, which is to say not based on specific scientific knowledge, but intuitions gained via experience, which is not bad at all. You need that too. But certainly will make your road there a lot bumpier. And if you try to teach someone else, it's pretty hard for me to teach you things I can't explain. Okay. All right. So these are the big important things out of this. I think this is a great way to start out the semester, and awesome.